There are so many of Russia's neighbors you have never heard of because they've disappeared from the pages of history, courtesy of the Russians. This isn't ancient history, it's a systematic pattern of elimination that explains why Eastern Europeans stampede into NATO the moment they get the chance. When people ask me why countries rush to join Western alliances, the answer isn't NATO conspiracy theories. It's the collective memory of what Russian friendship actually means: complete disappearance from the map. Russia has posed an existential threat to its neighbors forever, and the evidence is written in the names of states that no longer exist. Let me tell you about some of the neighbors you've probably never heard of and why their fate terrifies everyone unfortunate enough to share a border with Russia today. Russia didn't start as the massive continental empire we see today. It began as the modest Principality of Muscovy, centered around Moscow. But from the very beginning, Muscovy had a different character from its neighbors, one that prioritized expansion and absorption over coexistence and trade. While other medieval states developed complex diplomatic relationships and commercial networks, Muscovy specialized in eliminating competitors entirely. The first major victim was Novgorod the Great, and this case study reveals everything about how Russia operates. Novgorod was actually the more progressive alternative, a medieval merchant republic with democratic assemblies and extensive trade networks reaching from the Baltic to Constantinople. They had developed sophisticated legal codes, urban planning, and cultural institutions that made them one of the most advanced societies in medieval Europe. If history had gone differently, Novgorod might have led Russia down a completely different path toward constitutional government and commercial prosperity. Instead, Ivan III of Muscovy decided that Novgorod's independence was intolerable and systematically destroyed everything that made it unique. This wasn't just conquest, it was deliberate cultural obliteration designed to ensure that no trace of alternative governance models could survive to inspire future resistance. The Muscovites didn't just defeat Novgorod militarily, they eliminated its political institutions, dispersed its population, and erased its historical records. By the time they were finished, one of medieval Europe's most innovative societies had vanished as completely as if it had never existed. The pattern established in Novgorod became the template for Russian expansion everywhere. Identify a successful neighbor, create a pretext for intervention, overwhelm them with superior force, and then systematically destroy every institution and cultural marker that made them distinct. The goal was never just control, it was complete assimilation or elimination, ensuring that no alternative centers of power or identity could ever challenge Russian dominance. After eliminating the other Russian principalities, Moscow turned its attention to the sophisticated states of Central Asia: the Khanate of Crimea, the Khanate of Kazan, the Khanate of Astrakhan. These were not primitive tribal societies, but complex political entities with their own administrative systems, trade networks, and cultural achievements. The Crimean Khanate, in particular, had been a major power in Eastern Europe for centuries, maintaining diplomatic relations with the Ottoman Empire, Poland, and other European states. These khanates represented different ways of organizing society. Some were more nomadic, others more settled, but all had developed sophisticated approaches to governing diverse populations across vast territories. The Russians studied these systems carefully, not to learn from them, but to understand how to destroy them most effectively. The elimination of the Central Asian Khanates involved massive population transfers, cultural suppression, and the systematic destruction of historical records and monuments. The Russians didn't want to rule these societies, they wanted to replace them entirely with Russian institutions and Russian settlers. Then came the repeated vivisection of European neighbors, and this is where the pattern becomes truly horrifying for anyone trying to understand current events. Ukraine, Poland, Lithuania, Sweden, and Finland all suffered the same treatment: gradual territorial absorption, one bite at a time, until their independence became impossible to maintain. Poland's fate illustrates the systematic nature of Russian imperialism. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth had been one of Europe's largest and most powerful states, covering territory from the Baltic to the Black Sea and pioneering religious tolerance and constitutional monarchy centuries before these became common elsewhere in Europe. But Poland's geography made it vulnerable to the classic Russian strategy of coordinated pressure with other predatory neighbors. The three partitions of Poland in the 18th century eliminated one of Europe's most innovative societies through careful coordination between Russia, Prussia, and Austria. The Russians justified this by claiming they weren't taking Polish territory, but rather reclaiming lands that belonged to the Russian Empire, a technicality that fooled exactly no one but provided useful propaganda cover. What followed was even worse than the conquest itself. The Russians imposed a systematic campaign of cultural destruction designed to eliminate Polish identity entirely. Polish language was banned from schools and government, Catholic churches were closed or converted to Orthodox ones, and Polish historical records were either destroyed or rewritten to support Russian narratives. Thousands of Polish intellectuals, nobles, and priests were executed or deported to Siberia. The goal wasn't just to control Poland, it was to make sure that future generations would have no memory of what Polish independence had looked like. This is why modern Poles cannot stand Russians. It's not irrational prejudice. It's inherited trauma from generations of systematic oppression designed to eliminate their culture entirely. The genocide-laced occupation of Poland continued for several generations after World War II, when Stalin moved the entire country 200 kilometers west and ethnically cleansed millions of people in the process. This is not normal behavior between neighboring states. It's the action of a predatory empire that views other nations as obstacles to be eliminated rather than neighbors to coexist with. The Baltic states suffered similar treatment, and their experience explains why they were so desperate to join NATO the moment Soviet control ended. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania had been independent, prosperous societies with their own languages, cultures, and political systems. The Soviet occupation didn't just end their independence, it attempted to eliminate their identities entirely through massive deportations, forced Russification, and the systematic destruction of their cultural institutions. Hundreds of thousands of Balts were deported to Siberian labor camps and replaced with Russian settlers in a deliberate effort to make the Baltic states Russian in population as well as politics. When the Soviet Union finally collapsed, these societies retained just enough memory of their pre-occupation identities to reconstruct independent states, but the trauma of near elimination explains their desperate rush toward Western protection. Finland's experience demonstrates that resistance was possible but required extraordinary sacrifice and perfect timing. The Finns fought two brutal wars against Soviet invasion and managed to maintain their independence, but only by accepting permanent neutrality and allowing Soviet influence over their foreign policy. Even this partial success required geographical advantages, unified national resistance, and international circumstances that allowed Finland to balance between East and West. Most of Russia's neighbors weren't so fortunate. The pattern becomes even more disturbing when you look at how Russia has updated these historical methods for the modern era. The playbook remains the same. Identify successful neighbors, create pretexts for intervention, overwhelm them with superior force, and then systematically destroy their distinctive institutions and identities. But now the Russians use sophisticated information warfare, cyber attacks, and energy blackmail alongside traditional military pressure to achieve the same goals their ancestors accomplished with cavalry and cannon. Belarus illustrates how this updated system works. Lukashenko's regime uses Russian support to maintain power while gradually eliminating every institution that makes Belarus distinct. The Belarusian language is disappearing, independent media has been destroyed, and civil society crushed. Within a generation, Belarus may cease to exist as anything more than a Russian administrative district. This is the future that awaits every state unfortunate enough to fall within Russia's sphere of influence. The tragedy is that each of these eliminated societies had something valuable to contribute. Novgorod's democratic innovations, Poland's religious tolerance, the Baltic states' technological advancement, Central Asian Khanat's sophisticated governance, all lost because one imperial system couldn't tolerate alternatives. When people ask why NATO expansion happened so quickly, this history provides the answer. Eastern Europeans didn't need Western propaganda. They carried the memory of systematic elimination in their cultural DNA. They had seen what happened to societies that trusted Russian promises. The stampede into NATO wasn't Western conspiracy, it was collective survival instinct based on centuries of bitter experience. Understanding this pattern helps explain why current Russian behavior looks so familiar to anyone who studies imperial history. Putin isn't inventing new methods of domination. He's applying updated versions of the same techniques Russia has used for centuries to eliminate inconvenient neighbors. The only difference is that now the international community sometimes notices and objects, though not always effectively enough to prevent the pattern from continuing. The question for us is whether we've learned enough from this history to prevent it from repeating. The names of vanished societies warn us what happens when empires encounter insufficient resistance. We can honor their memory by ensuring the same fate doesn't await societies Russia threatens today.